The world is broken, and so are its denizens. There is a battle going on. The battle cry is mental health. Who will save us from this plague that is creeping across our nation of despair and brokenness? And so the government is turned to, and everyone cries, why are you not doing enough to help with people's mental health? Why are you not investing enough to save those who are despairing of purpose and filled with many various syndromes and disorders? Why will you not fix us? And the government says, certainly I will engage in this. I care so deeply about the mental health of those around me that I will invest heavily of our funds to solve this problem. And yet nothing ever changes except that the problem gets worse. So why is that? We might ask ourselves. Is it possible that the problem that we are facing, which has been dubbed in these circles the meaning crisis, that this problem is the result of people trying to attack fundamental problems of truth with tools that are inadequate to solve the dilemma that they are being designed to remove? What tool is being provided to you, I might ask, to help you resolve the cognitive dissonances in your own experience of life? I would offer to you that the only tools that you may actually wage war against this problem with are integrity and humility, as I have presented them in my last video. Without integrity, it is impossible to find consistency and to resolve what is at the root of our own dilemmas and moral problems which are causing us such mental anguish. Now, I say this, and some of you may say, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Fair. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychologist. I have no psychology training except that which relates to combat psychology. All I have are 20 years of combat and military leadership, church leadership, and many and varied personal interactions with people who are deeply hurt and broken. I cannot approach this problem as a psychologist, nor would I want to. I cannot approach this problem as a statistician who can evaluate the overall demographic responses to various problems. I can only speak as one who deals with people and one who believes perhaps that he has found some tools that might help you in your own battles with the world. So I said I was going to talk about PTSD, so let me do that. I'm going to try and keep this one a bit shorter in the aim of making it a little bit more consumable. So post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the plague that is currently undercutting huge swathes of our armed forces, both in the United States and Canada. If you want to talk about things that seem to happen with this idea of synchronicity that Jonathan Bugeaud talks about, after I had completed that interview with Paul Vanderklay, in which I discussed mental health on some level, and then put out my first video, the very next day I noted in Facebook that an old friend and colleague of mine, who's an American lieutenant colonel, was asking for help reviewing his own thesis for Air College, and he's doing that on post-traumatic stress disorder and on the best means of treating it, and certainly creating an environment where it's less likely to manifest as a chronic disorder. I'd say that was that was an unusual confluence of events. Let's put it that way. And for those of you that deny God his right to be involved in such things, I pity you for your unromantic and simple experience of life. So here it is. PTSD. Been able to snag some of his research and help define this a little bit better. Um, but I'll start before I get to that by dealing with what Jordan Peterson has to say about it a bit. So Jordan Peterson talks about PTSD as that thing which happens when something comes along which blows the axiom of your knowledge system away. So you're confronted with an experience which takes the first principles of your knowledge system and destroys them. It shows that these things are not true. And so he often associates it with naivete. And it is a naive person who becomes afflicted with PTSD. And so we have to look at that and say, well, what is PTSD? PTSD itself really is just defined more or less as a series of symptoms that are rooted in the response to some kind of outside stimulus or series of stimulus that are traumatic. And those responses are all basically associated with hypervigilance. You would have a recurring nightmares or recurring waking cognitive dissonance or dissociative experiences, I should say, where you're re-experiencing the event, but it's expressed more generally as hypervigilance and anxiety and nightmares and all of these things. So that's fine. Um, but there's little to kind of explain why it happens. So some clinicians and psychologists resent Peterson's definitions and say, well, you can't say that. I don't know. He can say that if he wants to. He's a clinician. He's somebody who deals with people, and he has discerned and wants to teach others that this is what he believes is the root cause of PTSD. At the end of the day, we know some pretty basic things about this. The basic things are you encounter a traumatic experience, and afterwards you are faced with a constant anxiety and recurring nightmares and bad experience with it. So he also talks about how you can heal from it by changing your worldview to incorporate the new information and to not live in fear of that event recurring, which he would say is the main issue, is that you're basically dealing with an awareness that things are not what you think they are, and so you don't have any mechanism to respond to the reality that you now confront. And that's fine. I think that that's quite a sound way of looking at what's going on when people confront PTSD. Now, it's a huge problem, uh, particularly in the armed forces. I know in the United States, statistically, they've got now, I think, over 500,000 soldiers that have been diagnosed with PTSD from the Iraqi and Afghanistan conflicts. So that's a large number. It's not the majority, but it's a large number. Now, when we're talking about this in particular, it's worth kind of looking at a definition. So I did get this from my friend's research here, but it's a quotation from American general who is dealing with this problem and basically defining what combat trauma is. So, combat trauma, he says, involves actual or threatened death or serious injury and causes an emotional reaction involving intense fear, panic, helplessness, anger, or horror. This results in persistent re experiencing of the events through nightmares, intrusive thoughts, or dissociative episodes, obsessive avoidance of any stimuli associated with the events, and feeling keyed up, aroused, angry, sleepless, jumpy all the time. So that is Major General Robert Dease's definition of combat trauma, along with his associates. Now, that's interesting because he's constrained combat trauma specifically to uh, actual or threatened death or serious injury. So he's basically saying it's a response to an awareness of mortality in the incident. Now, some would say, well, that's just the result of instinct, and it is a response that comes about because of an overproduction of certain chemicals in your brain, the imprinting of thoughts in the wrong place, the amygdala, I believe it is, and so on and so forth. They get down to the brass tacks of the chemical thing and whatever they think is happening, which, of course, they don't actually really know that because, neurology is not exactly a totally mapped out science, but those are pretty decent explanations of what might be happening. Let's put it that way. And that's fine. And no argument with you saying that. It's just that, you know, what you're suggesting is that there's something happening that is based on survival instinct. That's fine. But then why does it only become a disorder in a certain minority population, actually, of the people who experience those events? And I don't actually think that's probably true. I think that it's quite the majority of people in real combat situations that are confronted with direct and close combat. It is the vast majority of those who end up with PTSD, although there are many who have served that didn't quite end up in they may have participated even in some fighting, but they never ended up in the place of the imminent fear of death pressing itself upon them and so on. But uh, regardless, there are definitely people who have been in combat which have not developed a disorder from that. So why is that? What's different here and what's going on? So I think the important thing to understand here is if we're looking at this in terms of naivety and something that challenges the fundamental axioms of our knowledge system, what in the world is happening when somebody confronts death or serious injury that would challenge their worldview? Like, are you saying that you didn't think you were going to die? And so, like, you actually believed that you were going to live forever? Is that what's going on? Because I don't think there's a lot of people who have actually intellectually believed that. Um, no, I don't think that's it. Although there are definitely people who have never confronted their mortality, and they may intellectually be aware it's there, but they've never emotionally accepted that they will die. And this forces them to confront that reality, and they don't have a place for it. But I think more broadly that when you look at this, what happens when somebody confronts their mortality is that they become aware that they are not comfortable with it. They may have known that it was happening, and they may have even convinced themselves that they are all right with death. And they say, yeah, I'm comfortable with that. It's good. And, maybe in some cases that's true. I won't say it never is, but the reality is that when people confront their death and then they are plagued with constant recurring nightmares about it, it's because they don't want to die. And, if you're a nihilist and you say, I'm okay with death, death is nothing, it's the long sleep, nothing really matters in this world, or, there is no next, so whatever. Uh, but you're plagued with your mortality, then there's a problem. There's a flaw where your foundational beliefs do not actually explain your experience. And you might be able to explain it with just, oh, well, that's survival instinct, yada, yada. Yeah, that's great, but it does nothing to resolve the conflict between your worldview and your experience. So, what you're having go on here, and this happens too with people of religious context who think, I'm comfortable with what's going to happen next. Then they confront death and they're like, I'm not comfortable with dying. Well, I think I am, but I'm not, and that's a problem, you know. Uh, so you have this cognitive dissonance. You have a place where there's something in the world that is huge and looming, and I don't know what to do with that truth because it's a truth, and I know it is true. Even if I don't want to accept that it's true, I know, nevertheless, that that is so. And so your body is responding to that awareness with a constant urging to fix the problem, but there's no way to fix the problem because within the paradigm of your worldview, there's no place to go with that. So, yeah, this is where I talk about humility being one of the first things that you need to do, to have, and to work through in order to start both preparing yourself for these conflicts and overcoming them when they arise. So, if you are not humble enough to recognize that there's a problem with you having confronted a truth that you can't solve, that you don't have a place for, this dark truth, like the hard truths, and I don't have a place for that truth, and I have no means of even beginning to work on that problem that it presents me with. That, I've got a great ratchet, but um, the problem is that the house is on fire. So my ratchet is really good at ratcheting things, but I don't know what to do with it to put this fire out. Yeah, that's cool. You've got a great philosophical treatise on where you came from and why everything happens. Does nothing for your instinctive fear of death. So what are you going to do about that? Well, you need to humbly say, my worldview seems to be incomplete. It has not answered all of the problems I am confronted with. Maybe I need to move some of the foundation stones and see if there's something, or even move to a different house that seems to be better equipped to deal with this reality that I am confronting called life and death. So that's what it is. You've got to be humble enough to be willing to fix your structure, your ethical, moral structure that you live in. And, right, this brings us back to the integrity problem, question, I should say. So when your integrity is set up in such a way that it is resilient against this particular problem, like I have a space for death, and and it turns out that having confronted death, that that was adequate to resist that force from shifting me from my foundation stone. So good to go, no problems. Someone else whose foundation is not equipped to deal with that problem needs to adjust the way they built that foundation or move. Be humble, go to a place and assess its integrity to resist that problem that you're facing with, and then adopt it and and move on and move through the problem. This is my prognosis, or my prescription, I should say. But the thing about the definition that we just used is that mortality, well, that is not probably the biggest thing that is causing these mental health issues for soldiers. And I doubt that it is the biggest thing. Um, Maybe it should be, by the way, but I don't think it is the biggest thing that is causing most of these mental health issues that are being faced. I would suggest that the far bigger problem is that I did something wrong. And it may be that what is meant there is that you have not acted with integrity with your own worldview, so you have guilt over that. Um, but it also may be that you did things that were completely in line with your worldview, and yet you are now struggling with guilt over them because they did not pass some kind of spiritual test. And this is a real thing, guys. Like, you may believe something's true, and yet there's something inside of you that's screaming, no, that was not true. That was not good. It's not okay. And you can work that through intellectually all you want, but you'll never silence that voice inside of you that knows, nah, this is not good. There's something wrong. And so you constantly are mulling over this thing where either you have created a violation of what you thought was right, or you have done what you thought was right, but nevertheless recognized that it was a violation of some deeper truth that is outside of you. It's particularly problematic if you do not believe that there is such a thing as right and wrong. If you do not believe in evil and righteousness, then you don't even have a ratchet. Like, you're literally sitting there naked staring at the fire, and all you can do is try and put yourself on the fire and put it out with your flesh, and that's not going to work real well. Neither puts it out nor nor is it healthy to do. So yeah, you first must confront this reality. So let me just throw this one down. Um, you are evil. I am evil, and you are evil. And until you acknowledge that fact, you are going to constantly be unable to overcome the fact of guilt in your life. Especially problematic when you do not accept that you have a reason to be guilty. Because the reality is, you do, as do all men and women. The fact is that you are evil. And this is a problem uh, particularly potent for soldiers who have been in these combat life or death situations, because when you make a selfish choice in that environment, the consequences are very real. And even if they don't happen, your mind extends the thing that could have happened into reality. And you perceive much more clearly the depth of your own ability to cause harm and willingness to do that, frankly. So you are evil. And if you don't like that I'm saying that, here it is. You, whether you are willing to accept what I'm saying right now or not, you have people that you love, or that you uh, want to do right by. You may not even know what that means, but you know that it's true. And yet, you persistently hurt them with your own selfishness. This is a fact. I will say this confidently to every single person in the audience, that you have done this. You have hurt people that you care for because you are selfish. You have taken things that hurt people that uh, you didn't have a right to take, and you have done this because you are selfish. Right? You have hurt people's reputations through gossip and through true things that needn't have been said being said. And you have damaged their social standing, and you've done it probably sometimes intentionally and definitely without thinking through the consequences many times. Um, because you're like a person. That's what people do. We suck. We're really bad. We have a propensity and a proclivity for doing things which hurt others. And if you have adopted a worldview that says that's okay, well, I also know that on the inside you know that's not true. But it's neither here nor there. The point is that you do wrong things, and you know that they're wrong, and unless you have a worldview that lets you do something about that, you are going to contend with guilt, and you will have nothing to do about that. You can tell yourself whatever you want, and intellectually you can convince yourself of many things, being many different worldviews that will allow you to more or less function in the world. Um, but there's something inside of you that uh, does not feel content in that, and that's problematic, right? So the problem is my integrity. Is it in the right thing? I may have it. Now, if I don't have any at all, then I'm all kinds of problematic. But when I do begin to build something that has some coherent structure, uh, that is now a problem if it's not built on the right thing that actually resists the truth of the world around me. So this is how I'm going to explain this. Imagine that you have the ethical house, right? Your moral ethical house that you are going to build, and you're like, okay, so this is what my environment is going to be like, and that is what I'm going to build the house to deal with. So if you say, fundamentally, I am a good person, that's your first foundation stone. Fundamentally, other people are good people. It's your second foundation stone. And if they aren't, it's because there's something mentally broken in them, and it's not their fault. It's my third foundation stone. And um, there is no evil in the world. Death doesn't matter. Life doesn't matter. I've built all of my foundation stones. Great. And now I'm going to start building my structure called my life on top of this. So imagine that you have built a house that looks like a house that should do really well. And that's because you thought you were building a house for Mexico. So you've got a nice heat sinking structure that draws coolness from the ground. It's got a high albedo to reflect the light, whether you're using white um, mortar or spackling on the outside, clay, adobe, whatever. And so that reflects the light and doesn't gather the heat, and that's good. You've got a lot of ventilation so the wind can blow through to cool the inside of the house. You see oftentimes in these like Caribbean and Central American homes that they have like a concrete lattice system and open windows everywhere with just, screen if anything. And then, flat roof makes lots of sense because then we can go up there in the cool of the evening, get out of the house that's absorbed the day's heat, and stay up there in the breeze until the house cools off. That's great. Maybe put some walls around it because you don't want people falling off that house. That's a good idea. And we'll put our gutters in the corners, four corners, so that they can take the water. And we'll maybe give it a slight gradient so that, there's no sink in the middle where we can have puddles. But it's not hugely important, you know. Cool. But then you found out that the place you built your house, um, well, it seemed really hot while you were building your house, is called Canada. And come September, you start to really regret that you didn't put any glass windows in the house because you wanted the wind to blow through. And then you try to fix that, but you've got another problem, which is that, you don't have any insulation and you don't even have a place for a stove or heat source inside. And so that's a problem. And then it starts to snow, and the snow is all getting inside the bowl that you built on top of your house. It's starting to melt a little because of the stove you put in the center trying to stay alive inside this bloody heat sink that you've created. And the ice starts to melt and it clogs the drains, and then you've got heavy ice building up on your roof. It's fantastic, and then the whole thing falls on top of you. And that's because you built a house that seemed out, it had consistent integrity, but it was not designed for the world in which you lived. So um, let's up the ante here and say that a lot of people in our world today, a lot of the kids coming through the education system now and experiencing life in their 20s, uh, you know, teens and up to late 20s, have been taught that there's no such thing as evil. All worldviews are subjective and relative. Everyone's basically good. There's no such thing as right and wrong. All of this stuff. Well, their house is built for Mexico, and the problem is that their world is actually a lot more like Mars, right? So you have not actually built for any of the forces that you have to face, or to resist any of the things that want to destroy you in that world, and it's a huge problem. So I challenge you that the issue of post traumatic stress disorder is one that arises in the main because things have happened and you have no solution for those things. There's a lot of stuff that I could talk about. Like, there are physical consequences of long term stress, and that's something that you may never stop dealing with, and so be it, right? There's also physical consequences to blowing your leg off, and people have to deal with that for the rest of their life. Okay. Um, People's health can be actually ruined by this stuff. But that's not really what we're discussing right now. What we're discussing is the persistent and unresolvable conflict that happens because of experiencing something evil, or perhaps not even just evil, but uh, it might be that it confronts the evil inside of us and we don't know what to do about it. And if you are not experiencing that, that's great. I mean, good for you. Maybe, because maybe the issue is that you just haven't found that problem yet that's going to make you confront the issues with your worldview and what you believe. So I would challenge you to convince your brain that it needs to actually look at these things with humility and honestly evaluate whether or not the world is what you think it is, and whether or not the belief system that you have framed your life around actually gives answers to that world that is really there. That's what you need to do. That is having the humility to construct integrity that is designed for the real world environment so that it can actually resist the real forces that are there. It's totally pointless to build your moral ethical framework in such a way that it doesn't have the structure to deal with the real world. If it does not address the fact that you have evil inside of you, that's a problem. And if it doesn't give you a framework to respond to having done evil, that is going to be a huge problem for you. And eventually it's going to consume you, you know, unless you totally ignore it and manage to just evade ever thinking about these things, which I suspect not a lot of people on this channel are doing. So there we go. My concluding remark is this: I have tested Christ. I have tested Christ in many and varied conflicts. I have I have dealt with evil, and sadly I do recognize that a lot of Christian apologists do a very poor job of evil, and that's sad. But I have tested evil, and my worldview is consistent with that. And my God is consistent with that, and it does not create a dissonance in my understanding. I have confronted my own evil, and I have found a place for that in Christ, and I have found freedom from it in Christ. I have peace with these things, and I have been in the darkest places. Some of you have been in darker places, I'll give you that. But I've been in some of the darkest territories. So it's working. It's true. Maybe if yours is not enough for these problems you're facing, you need to humbly consider that Christ is possibly the answer that you're looking for. And maybe we'll talk about what that actually means another time. Cheers.